In this lesson, let's take a look at a couple modifiers that help us deform existing geometry.
Here I just have a cube that's subdivided 4 times to give us more geometry, but it's at too simple so it doesn't get smoothed out. And I'm going to go to Add Modifier, Deform, and first let's look at Simple Deform. This one allows us to really easily achieve some common deformation effects. The first one is Twist, and by changing the angle you can see how it changes how much this cube gets twisted, and which axis it gets twisted around can be changed down here in the axis. So we can twist it around the y-axis or around the z. We can also bend this cube, taper it, or add a bit of squash or stretch. There's not a lot of controls for this modifier, but it is incredibly helpful. The main thing to know is that it relies on the object origin as well as the local orientation. So if I were to go into edit mode for our cube here, and hit G and Z and move it up so that it's above the object origin, we'll get a much different result than when the object origin is in the middle or when it's below. So just remember that this is heavily dependent on the object origin, and the axis here is not the world axis, but the local axis. So if I go to my move tool, you can see that the x-axis is pointing along the global x-axis. And if I twist it around that axis, it makes sense. But since this is working on the local axis, I can double tap R and just rotate this freely, and this deformation stays in place. If I switch from global to local orientations, then we can see which axis it's twisting around. This is pretty intuitive when it comes to 3D objects, but using this on planes, which is one of the most common use cases, does get a bit confusing. So I'm going to hide my cube here, and I just have a subdivided plane as a different example. Again, I'll add modifier and simple deform. And this time I'd like it to arc over the y-axis, just a simple bend in this direction. Well, to do that, I'll set the type to bend, and you'll notice that nothing happens. In fact, it's extra confusing because if you go into edit mode and move our plane, it really freaks out. The bend mode is a little bit more confusing than the other modes, but also it's one of the most useful, so I want to explain exactly how it works here. What you need to do is line up this axis, whichever one you choose in the modifier, in this case the x-axis, such that it runs along the center of the bend. So in this case, we want it to bend around the y-axis, so we'll actually set this to y instead. But then the second thing that we need to do is turn it so that the x-axis is pointing upwards, because it also relies on the tangent axis, and that's not really specified here in the modifier. So I wish that was the second option that we could set here, but in this case, we just have to remember that the tangent axis for the y is going to be the x-axis, and we want that x-axis to be pointing away from the bend. So we could either go into edit mode and, rotate our plane and change the local orientation relative to the geometry that way, or we could also go to our rotate tool, go up to our tool options, and turn on effect only origins. Now, if I rotate this, I'm not going to rotate the plane, I'm going to rotate the local orientation and the object origin. So if I want the x to be pointing upwards, I can just rotate around the y-axis, hold down Control so it goes in even increments, and snap that so it's pointing straight up. Now as I change my angle, this is working perfectly. Another way to do that is to use a second object as the origin for the modifier. So I'll hit Control Z and undo that, and then I'll go to Options and turn off Effect Only Origins. And this time I'm going to add an empty. I'll hit Shift A, let's go down to Empty and Plane Axes, which is an object with no geometry information, but it does have an object origin and it does have a local orientation. So then I can go to my plane and choose that empty as the object here. And then as I move this empty around, you can see it does affect it, but moving it really freaks it out. But what we want to do is rotate it such that the y-axis is cutting across the bend, and then rotating it such that the x-axis is pointing up. So we'll go into front view here, rotate this 90 degrees, and I'll hit negative so that the x-axis is pointing up, and now you can see this works just like it should. If I go back to that modifier, I can change the angle, and I can also move this around just like I could with the object origin to change where the bend is starting from. The reason this is so helpful is because it's really difficult to work on curved surfaces. So if you have a surface that has a little bit of a curve to it, what you can do is set up the simple deform modifier such that when you're in edit mode, you can work on it completely flat and you don't have to worry about that at all. But then when you tab back into object mode, it just kind of snaps back into place with that curve. Because with the simple deform modifier enabled, if I go into top view, then I'm not going to get a flat representation of this, and that's just harder to work with. When this is disabled though, I can work with these vertices very easily. I can change the shape, I can add loop cuts, I can do whatever I need to do. And then in object mode, that change is just curved right into place. So the whole goal of these simple deform modifiers is being able to work more easily in edit mode with a less complicated mesh. Just be aware that in order to actually deform, you need the geometry to support it. If I didn't have this subdivision surface modifier, then this wouldn't look very interesting, because there's not enough geometry running horizontally in order to actually support that curve. In order to do that, then I need to add in some loop cuts here, and now it looks nice and smooth. So you can either do that with a subdivision surface modifier if your object supports it, or you can add in geometry manually if you need to. Another really helpful deform modifier is the lattice modifier. For that, I'll just look at a subdivided Suzanne, and then let's add modifier, deform, and lattice. This one needs a lattice type object, so let's hit Shift A and add lattice. This is a completely different object type than we've looked at before, but all you need to know is that it's simply a grid. I'll hit slash to go into local view, so we're looking at just the lattice, and if we go to the lattice data properties over in the properties editor, we can see that our main settings are a resolution U, V, and W, which in this case just corresponds to the X, Y, and Z axes. So if I increase these to 3, then we're going to get one cut in each direction. So this is similar to subdividing it, but we're not just getting a cube that has cuts all the way around it. This also creates points in the middle of this volume. So it's a 3-dimensional array. What's cool about this though, is that I can now tab into edit mode and change any of these points. So it knows where its original position is, and it knows where its adjusted position is. What I can do then is use these points as sort of a reference for how we want to bend or distort our object. So if I hit slash to exit local view, I'll scale this up such that it's surrounding our monkey head here. Something like that. And I'll even scale it down along the Z-axis so it fits a little bit better. Just like so. And let's also scale it along the Y-axis. So Suzanne fits nicely inside. And maybe we want one more cut over in the X direction because it's looking a little bit sparse there. So I'll increase that to 5. Now it looks like our grids are pretty even. And what's really cool is that I can now go to the lattice modifier that we have on Suzanne and choose this lattice as the lattice object. And then whenever I hit tab to go into edit mode here and take one of these points and move it around, it's going to move the closest geometry of Suzanne in that direction. So we can really easily distort what this looks like without actually changing any of the original mesh. So we can manipulate these points just like any other points. We can't extrude them or anything like that, but we can scale them up and rotate them and do a lot of our basic operations. We could get this effect for Suzanne just as easily in edit mode, but the reason it's so helpful to do as a modifier is it allows us to keep our mesh incredibly simple. When I tab into edit mode and I disable my modifiers here, and the deformation is only applied in object mode. So it allows me to work simply, but still get a more complex result that's also adjustable at any time. If I were to actually apply these edits to Suzanne, for example, I'll use the drop down and choose apply and tab into edit mode, this is going to be a lot harder to work with. I can no longer work with symmetry. Things aren't going to be aligned to any of the axes. So using the lattice modifier as well as the simple deform modifier helps you keep things nice and simple and clean and aligned in edit mode while still getting some great deformations in object mode. Now, when it comes to animation, you can use these modifiers,
But for more complex deformations, you'll definitely want to look into armatures and rigging, which is a big topic, and so it'll be an entire course all on its own called The Fundamentals of Rigging by Wayne Dixon. So check that out if you're curious, and you can also check out Paul's videos on these modifiers if you want to dive a little bit deeper into them. But for now, just give the simple deform and lattice modifiers a try, and I'll see you in the next lesson.